Thank you very much, Barry, and thank you all for inviting me. This is a bit of a homecoming for me. I grew up in Berkeley and Oakland and graduated from Berkeley High School. And I've been working with Barry and some of the other folks in the room for many years. And you all are great leaders, and we're eager to help you continue to lead. I'm going to be talking about building performance standards and putting them in context, providing sort of hopefully the foundation for the great slot of panelists that we have today. And so what is a building performance standard? It is a policy that applies to existing buildings. Typically, it's most large existing buildings are subject to a building performance standard. And it establishes minimum performance standards for those buildings. It will establish minimum energy or climate standards, and sometimes it can also establish other minimum standards for buildings. It's different from building codes, which usually kick in whenever someone is looking to get a building permit. Building performance standards are incredibly powerful because they apply at a date certain to all buildings, whether or not they're pulling building permits. So they work together, they complement each other very well. They complement building codes, and building performance standards work together. And obviously a new building, once it's in operations, it immediately becomes an existing building and should be subject to building performance standards. So the two policies need to be designed with that in mind. Building performance standards have a long-term requirement typically, and then there are intermediate reporting and compliance periods. And I'll go into that a little bit more, where these policies become more stringent over time. So each reporting period, a building is expected to perform better than in the prior period. They provide flexibility to building owners. We know that building owners know their buildings best, the nature of their operations, the financing, the physical constraints, the end of life of equipment, and they should have the greatest flexibility to achieve improvements in their buildings. But we also need policies that convey that we have a climate emergency and other urgent goals and are encouraging building owners to take early action. So policies need to balance those considerations. Building performance policies are the most powerful tool available to drive improved building performance. And some of the impacts that can be seen from the existing building performance policies. There are now 10 in the United States plus Vancouver, Canada, that are jurisdictions that have adopted building performance standards. You can see in Washington, D.C., their building performance standard, which is the first to go into effect, is expected to reduce energy use in buildings by 20% and cut 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent annually. At Washington State, 14 million tons annually by 2035. New York City, they're expecting 126,000 new green jobs and a $20 billion investment to get buildings to comply with their building performance standard between now and 2030. So significant, impactful results. These are great policies, and with great power comes great responsibility. So they need to be crafted very carefully to make sure that you're producing equitable outcomes. We're working with jurisdictions to give a lot of care to that. As I've said, they complement other policies. They can complement renewable energy policies along the lines of what Barry just talked about, REACH codes, voluntary programs, benchmarking and transparency laws. All of them can work together and should work together in a seamless whole. Building performance standards are not benchmarking. Building performance standards actually require improved performance. So they require that buildings meet specific targets by specific deadlines with specific consequences if they don't. They use benchmarking data as a baseline, and they use the Energy Star Portfolio Manager system as the vehicle for complying and reporting and demonstrating that the building is meeting the energy and water requirements. They drive continuous improvement across the entire building stock. Benchmarking only requires that building owners have to measure their energy performance and disclose that for the world to see. So it's a very good policy, and it's a foundational policy that building performance standards build upon. And in those jurisdictions that don't already have benchmarking laws, when they've adopted building performance standards, they've simultaneously adopted benchmarking laws. And typically the benchmarking law goes into effect a couple of years before the building performance standard. That visibility should create, from a benchmarking law, should create a virtuous cycle of competition where building owners are seeking to improve their performance to attract and retain the best tenants and investors. And you can see from the prior slide that this is a map of the more than 40 jurisdictions around the country that have either benchmarking laws, and those are shown in green and blue, and then beyond benchmarking laws, which are those jurisdictions shown in purple, that have policies that include building performance standards, but other policies like audit and retrocommissioning requirements as well, that require that building owners take action to improve building performance. IMT has been working with jurisdictions to adopt benchmarking and transparency laws. We helped write the very first transparency law in Washington, D.C. back in 2008, and we're involved in AB 802 in California, and in the various jurisdictions across the country that have written building benchmarking and transparency laws. And you can see that these laws are taking off. There are now more than 40 actually around the United States in force, and more jurisdictions adding benchmarking laws all the time. Building performance standards are much newer. The first one went into effect in 2019. That was again in Washington, D.C. And now in just the space of 3 years, we have 10 in the United States and plus Vancouver, Canada. And that includes 3 states: Washington State, Colorado, and Maryland all have building performance standards in place. So they're on a faster uptake trajectory than benchmarking laws. And we fully expect that they will proliferate more and more, initially probably in places like the Bay Area and California, and moving out to other jurisdictions. I don't have enough time to go talk about all of these laws, but very briefly, there are a few variables that the laws treat differently. One of them is the size of buildings, and the smallest buildings that are subject to these building performance standards are 10,000 square feet, and that's in Washington, D.C. And that won't phase in for another 12 years. It starts at 50,000 square feet and then goes to 25, and then finally down to 10. In New York, the floor is 25,000 square feet, and in several other jurisdictions, the floor is 50,000 square feet. So this is not a policy for single-family homes or very small buildings. The cost benefit of working with such small buildings isn't really there right now. They also have different performance metrics. In Washington, D.C., it's Energy Star, a 1 to 100 score is the fundamental performance compliance metric. In New York City, it's tons of greenhouse gas equivalents per square foot. And in St. Louis and several other jurisdictions, including Washington State, it's site energy use intensity. Each of these have only one performance metric. Vancouver is the first jurisdiction to have multiple performance metrics. And I think we'll see more and more jurisdictions with multiple performance metrics. These laws all apply to existing commercial and multifamily buildings, usually with exemptions for like manufacturing facilities. Another important difference is that in Washington, D.C. and St. Louis, the standard is recalculated every cycle. So the buildings in, say, Washington, D.C., buildings have to be at least at the median level. And then a number of buildings are going to have to improve their performance to get to that median, and then it's recalculated each 5-year cycle, similar in St. Louis. That has a disadvantage of not providing as much long-term certainty. The New York law actually sets out in advance exactly how buildings are going to be required to perform for the next 30 plus years. So building owners have a better long-term certainty about what's required of them. And that is a policy that we recommend. IMT heard from a number of jurisdictions that were trying to put in place building performance standards. And in response to those requests for assistance, we created a model building performance standard law that incorporates lessons learned from the already adopted building performance standards. We took the best of each of those laws. It was reviewed and had extensive input from real estate, social equity, building science, government, policy experts. And the model law is available for download from our website, as well as a presentation, a longer presentation laying it out, and a summary of it, and a number of other resources, including comparisons of all the existing policies. And we are supporting almost all of the jurisdictions that are developing or implementing existing building performance standards. The principles behind devising a good building performance standard are similar to principles that apply to other policies. In particular, you want to make sure to start off with the end in mind, that you're designing any policy to achieve your goals and commitments, and the climate commitments are certainly very important. So you want to understand how buildings are going to need to perform in your jurisdiction to achieve any climate commitments that have already been made. And of course, that it should entail looking at the other aspects of your economy as well. Now, social and racial equity should be front and center in any policy making. There shouldn't be any decision making without affected stakeholders at the table, especially stakeholders from traditionally disinvested communities. Regulatory fairness, making sure that you're asking about the same level of effort from all building owners and that other stakeholders are treated fairly. And jobs and economic growth are always important. High road jobs, jobs that are living wage and providing jobs to those communities that need them most. Maximizing certainty is really important to all of the other goals, to getting the investments in our buildings, to lowering our greenhouse gas emissions, to getting long-term job growth and economic growth. And so building owners will not make a 30-year investment, say, in new heat pumps or a new envelope if they don't know that that investment is going to serve them well for the next 30 years. Similarly, transparency is important, not just as part of a benchmarking law, but broadly. This is such a powerful policy. You need to be transparent about how building owners and others are being treated. Then, as I said, we want to balance the need to drive early action to meet the climate crisis and to accommodate building life cycle events, situations like tenant turnover, refinancing, mortgages, end-of-life equipment, when investments to improve a building's performance are often most effective and least costly. And lastly, we want to make sure that the policy is as simple as practical and as easy for building owners and others to comply and for the jurisdictions to implement. And that gets into the question of resources. There are some real trade-offs around, ambition versus simplicity, and we work with jurisdictions to navigate those trade-offs. Building performance standards don't just have to be about energy or carbon. They can also address things like inclusiveness and equity, helping buildings be an asset to the grid, to contribute to grid reliability, largely by being flexible about their loads, improving resilience in the event of climate change and wildfires and other new challenges that face our citizens and our buildings, and help with utility bill affordability and energy burden. So the IMT model building performance standard law addresses this in a number of ways. I don't have time to go into it very much at all, but the specific performance metrics that are laid out in the law are site energy use intensity, and that's intended to drive efficiency, on-site and district thermal greenhouse gas emissions, that's intended to drive decarbonization of buildings, water use intensity, obviously important in a place like California, coincident peak demand as a way to help buildings be good grid citizens, not use as much electricity at peak periods when there's a risk of blackouts, and ventilation and indoor air quality, especially important in view of the pandemic. And then to advance social priority, there are a number of provisions built into our model law. Again, the process is so important to make sure that disinvested communities have a powerful voice in policymaking, but specific protections around anti-displacements, housing protections, assuring that investment costs are not passed on to tenants, especially low-income tenants, and owners will inevitably need flexibility in some cases where they can't meet the standards. And we've built in a building performance action plan mechanism for that. But owners should be encouraged to proffer benefits that they can provide to their community. Things like making their buildings available as an emergency cooling shelter during heat emergencies as part of their proposals when they seek flexibility from building performance standards. The central innovation of the law is, the model law is the trajectory approach. And that recognizes that not all buildings are the same. So we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to all buildings. Some buildings start out using a lot of energy. Some buildings start out using much less energy and water and other metrics. The same trajectory approach can be applied to almost every performance metric. So the buildings that use the most energy, in this example, that would be building A. This is highly simplified. So the vertical axis is building energy use. That could be site energy use intensity. The horizontal axis is time. On the right, you see the final standard compliance deadline. That would be typically like 30 years out. And then every 5 or so years in between, you'd have interim standards, at which point buildings are evaluated to see if they're complying with the building performance standard. Building A uses the most energy, so it's expected to improve at the fastest rate, with all buildings expected to perform at the same excellent level by the final performance standard, say 30 years out. But building A is also permitted to use more energy in every interim period. So it's expected to improve the most at the fastest rate, but also permitted to use more energy in each interim period in absolute terms. So in this way, we're providing long-term certainty to all the building owners. They all know upfront exactly what will be required of their buildings for the next 30 years. But we're also equitably sharing out the level of effort required of each building, which can also be very important from a political acceptance perspective. And we recognize that buildings don't improve in straight lines. The building owner makes the decision. It's not dictated by the jurisdiction. The building owner decides what they're going to do in their building to improve performance. In this example, they use lighting upgrades and a building tune-up in the first period, followed by an envelope upgrade, followed by a mechanical upgrade. And at every point, they are in compliance in each interim period. But different building owners will choose different strategies, different technologies, different sequencing. So long as they improve at or better than that slope, they are in compliance with the law. The National Building Performance Standard Coalition, as Barry mentioned, is a new coalition of jurisdictions that have all committed to adopt building performance standards and supporting policies by Earth Day 2024. And you'll hear in the panel later today from federal agencies that are committed to supporting the jurisdictions in the Building Performance Standard Coalition with resources around policy design and implementation. You can see here the website for the coalition. President Biden announced it on January 21st. There are, as I said, 37 jurisdictions around the country that are part of it. In the Bay Area, we have San Francisco that is a part of the Building Performance Standard Coalition. And of course, other California jurisdictions, Sacramento, LA, San Diego, Chula Vista, which is the only jurisdiction in California so far that has already adopted a building performance standard, and other jurisdictions around the country. Membership remains open, so you can go to that website. It requires a commitment by the chief executive of your jurisdiction in order to become part of that coalition, a commitment to put the new policy in place by Earth Day 2024. And I'm happy to take questions about that offline. Thank you very much. Look forward to a great conversation, and I'll give it back to Barry.